Hey everybody. In this video, we're going to start, because I want to talk about traffic, and then we're going to switch to our final topic, which is positive externalities. So traffic is not a positive externality. I just didn't catch this point in the previous video, and I want to make sure we cover it. So I like talking about traffic because, one, it's something that affects all of us. Where is that? That there? That's Manila. But you've probably experienced traffic. Hopefully not that bad. That's pretty intense. When I used to take my 3-year-old to Manila, he thought that driving around in this was the best part of Manila, and I would argue it was the worst. It missed a lot of flights, but if you're not 3 years old, this may not be enjoyable for you. And so we think of traffic as a negative externality, right? We are just one car driving, but our presence, along with the presence of everybody else, is imposing a relatively major set of costs on the people around us. We are congesting the roads, which makes it difficult for other people to get where they need to go. We're producing noise pollution. We're producing air pollution. I don't even know what we're doing for the poor pedestrians who are trying to navigate this maze. But we think of traffic congestion as having a lot of negative externalities. And so I want to highlight this particular point because this is an area where people have spent a lot of time trying to think about policies that can reduce traffic congestion. Some of these include building additional capacity, right? So, in this case, you can see that what might have been a smaller road is now 5 lanes in each direction with a train running in between and then 5 lanes on the other side. If you look at highways in Los Angeles, you get these massive, massive highways. In practice, that doesn't seem to work too much because essentially you haven't solved the externality problem. You've just increased the supply of roads. And so often what ends up happening is just more people will drive on those roads until you get back up to a congested equilibrium. We also see expansions of public transport. You can see that's what's happening here. In the case of the Philippines, they're having issues getting enough trains to run, such that the lines on the trains become really, really, really long. And so that's a whole another problem, but expansions of public transport can be good if they are offering an alternative that is desirable, right? So if you think about some place like New York City, public transit can be much faster than taking a car because you're avoiding just kind of skating under all of the traffic. And essentially what you're doing there is you're making the relative benefit of driving less because there's another option that might be affordable and more convenient, or at least maybe less risky in terms of time. There's also been some interesting work in terms of thinking about pricing to try to price out the externality. So for example, in London, there is a congestion charge, and essentially in that little red area up there, at this point when I took this screenshot, it was about 11.5 pounds, what is that, about $13 US, if you drive your vehicle in this zone between 7 to 6 p.m., during the days of the week. Weekends is fine because that's not when there's a congestion issue. The idea with this is that you're not necessarily restricting vehicles. Vehicles can come and go, but you're restricting vehicles to those who value it the most. And essentially what you're doing is you're charging people for that impact that they're having. In the case of something like if you're a delivery truck, right, and you need to get in the city to bring, bread, soda, whatever it is, to the places it needs to go, this 11 pounds 50 is not going to be a big deal relative to the profits you're bringing in. And so for you, it's high value to drive into the city. You're going to do so. But if you're a person who might be commuting into the city every day, that's going to really add up. And so it might encourage you to try to find other options. So essentially people are kind of paying for their externality. Now, this can lead to questions about like the distribution and who's it affecting, etc. But that's one approach. Other approaches you see, Singapore, for example, restricts the number of vehicles. Essentially what they do is you have a registration, just like we have a registration, like a car registration, but your registration is good for 10 years and it's auctioned. So essentially what's happening is the government's capping the number of cars that can be on the road. And then instead of setting a price, $100, $1,000, people can essentially bid it up based on what demand was. And so, for example, in like 2008, 2009, you could get a 10-year license for just a few $1,000s. By 2013, 14, 15, it was actually up to about $100,000. Which is a lot, right? But essentially, it was reflecting the supply and demand. And so they didn't even have to make a decision about how many. They just set a target and auctioned off the rest. And that was a way of restricting the number of vehicles. You could actually get a slightly cheaper license that would only let you drive in off hours and weekends. It was like a different color. There's also been work in terms of road space rationing or license plate days. The idea being that if you have a particular, if your license plate ends in an 8, you don't get to drive on every other Thursday. If it's a 9, every other Friday, something like that, is a way of basically saying if we have X number of cars, then they'll all drive about 20% less. And so that should take some pressure off the road. This hasn't worked as well as people have hoped, particularly because in some contexts, the wealthier people are the ones who are driving, and they might have the resources to actually just buy a second registration and either swap cars or plates. And so it hasn't been as successful as people have hoped, as opposed to something like this congestion pricing, which people have found works really well because it's targeted to specifically the problem. It's not people driving their cars, it's driving their cars in particular places. And here you're still allowing them the option. If you have the rationed license plate, you can't drive, even if you need to. But the congestion pricing just basically means you have to pay for the privilege to do so. If we think about which of these things have been ineffective, the things that have really, really been ineffective in terms of affecting congestion is really that road capacity. That's the one where nothing's changed about the incentives. You've increased the road capacity, it temporarily reduces congestion, but in the long run, it doesn't actually lead to any change in behavior. It just gets more people on the road and then puts us back at an equilibrium. You can see how congestion charges have been effective in terms of reducing congestion traffic. So here you can see that what happened is essentially it was between 2002 and 2003 where the congestion impacts, where the pricing went into effect, and it affected private vehicles, but it didn't affect public vehicles, right? Because and they considered a taxi to be a public vehicle, like a taxi, a bus, were not affected. Obviously, bicycles were not affected. And what you can see here, actually can't say motorcycles, I don't know. So if you saw across the board a reduction in driving, you might think, well, then something else happened, right? For example, during COVID, there was a mass reduction in driving, not because of a policy, just because everyone was staying home. But that we see that for this type of vehicle, we see an increase, and we see this massive reduction in cars, those who are probably most able to change and have the strongest willingness to change their behavior. We see a massive reduction in the amount of traffic on the roads, a 34% decrease just within 1 year. And that's before people have time to adapt. So this suggests that this type of charge can be really effective in targeting reductions. In a place like Singapore, for example, it's not even just it's £11.50. It's actually adjusted by the type of vehicle and also the time of day. So you have like a little electric, kind of like those toll passes. It tells you what time it is, and it tells you what your time ranges. And so from 6:05 to 7:05, there's a $2 charge for cars going into the city, a $5 charge for trucks. At 7:25, I think it drops down to say $1, and then eventually it's $0. So it's actually dynamic pricing as the day goes on, and it varies day by day. Motorcycles, I think, pay half the charge of a car, and so that also gives like even more control than just the flat rate, because if you think about, say, Monday through Friday, there are certain times of days where you want people to be, if they're going to be commuting, to commute because there's not a lot of traffic versus high traffic times of day. And you can do the same thing with your transit pricing as well if you want to try to kind of push people, give them discounts for early bird fares, etc. So really what's exciting about this is people playing with the incentives to help capture those externalities and reduce some of the congestion problems. And if you ever have the pleasure of driving around Singapore, you'll see that people complain about the traffic, and it's really lovely because there's really not that much traffic. Okay. So just as we have negative externalities, like we said, we have positive externalities. So here there's a benefit that accrues to others who didn't participate in the actual economic decision. One of my favorite examples is education, right? You are paying for an education, either with money or time or both, and you will accrue a private benefit. That private benefit is both the knowledge that you gain and the ability to transfer those skills into other things that bring you joy in life, like jobs, careers, businesses, etc., right? But the fact that you're getting an education is very good for me. It helps me because it means that you're paying more taxes, which can fund more delightful things for me to enjoy. It's also good because it means that you're going to go be good educated voters and make good decisions to help me, right? So I am benefiting. There's a positive externality accruing to me if you get educated, right? And that's true for our whole country kind of as a whole, and really for the world, right? When people are more educated, they produce new and exciting inventions, and those can spread and help the whole world. So education is full of positive externalities. And in fact, what we see is that these types of educations can lead to really big, broad benefits. So for example, here, this is an economic paper written for an economic audience, so the words are small and long, thinking about public public education via TV, specifically through Sesame Street. So Sesame Street's been around in the U.S. since 1969, but it also delivers lessons all over the world, and it does so through broadcast TV, which we also think as kind of being that what we'll talk about later is the public good, in the sense that it kind of benefits everyone who touches it, right? And so what ends up happening is that even people who don't pay for Sesame Street, because it just comes to them through broadcast TV, get benefits in terms of educational attainment and labor market outcomes. Actually, I take that back. It's inconclusive on those things, but it does improve school readiness. Sorry, I'm reading and talking at the same time. You should read the thing. So when we have these benefits, these external benefits or positive externalities, these benefits can accrue to other people, right? And sometimes they can be things that are glorious, like education. Sometimes they can be a bit horrendous, like this example of motorcycle riders. Unfortunately, when states like Michigan removed the helmet laws, it led to an increase in the availability of organs, which is really quite horrific unless you need an organ. So because we know when we have positive externalities, markets produce too little because there are benefits to society that aren't captured in the price of it, we're going to see that there's a role for government subsidies to play and to help the market work better. So for example, if I stick with preserved farmland as something that has a nice social benefit, in the sense that if we think about preserved farmland versus development, we think it's, aesthetically pleasing. We like having fresh food in our communities, etc. We can imagine that, as we produce more and more, there's a cost that increases and there's a benefit, and that benefit accrues to society, right? This is the societal benefit. And if I'm a farmer, I don't see the societal benefit. I just get my own personal benefit, which is so much less. And so if we think about a socially optimal point, it's going to be the point at which the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost. It's not the case that we say, marginal social benefits of protected farmland are positive, therefore we should just protect all the farmland, right? There's also a cost we're giving up by protecting farmland. We're not using that land for development, new homes, new businesses, etc. Right? But we could think that there's a socially optimal point. But the market outcome is that essentially for a farmer, they don't see any of this benefit. And so as soon as there's a cost to preserving their farmland, they're not going to take it because they don't see their private benefits relatively small compared to the cost. So you're going to end up with basically no preserved farmland. And so that's going to be inefficient because the marginal social benefit is so high relative to the cost. So the way that we can solve this is something called a Pigouvian subsidy, or we can just say a subsidy, that's fine. A payment that encourages activities that yield external benefits. So for example, in something like the farmland, if what you want to do is have the farmer be incentivized to protect their farmland, you want to basically pass some of this benefit onto the farmer, right? So essentially you could pay the farmer to do the behavior that generates these benefits. And because society is willing to pay to have this farmland, through the government, they can pay the farmer to have this farmland. Essentially, if we can target it such that it equals the marginal social benefit at the optimal quality, then we can reach that quality because that's going to be now internalized to the farmer. We see the same thing happen in the world of education through federal student aid programs like Pell Grants, etc. We're essentially promoting education, and we're saying, look, you're generating benefits to society. We want you to have more education. So we're going to reflect that by passing on some of this marginal social benefit to you to encourage you to engage in this behavior. The last type of sort of spillover or externality I want to touch on just really briefly is this idea of a technology spillover. So here, in a way, it's an external benefit. In a way, it's an externality. But the difference here is that we're actually talking about knowledge spreads. So it's like a subset of externalities. And the idea here is that if you have a lot of firms, a lot of individuals close together, that can create technological spillovers and the idea of information sharing. The classic example of this is Silicon Valley, right? Any firm can develop, innovate, invest in research, but it's not random that there's such a agglomeration of firms within Silicon Valley. It's not just that they like the weather, right? It's that they're all close to each other, and so they can they can hire across different firms, they can learn from each other. Essentially, it's kind of like a hub of knowledge that in turn has made this a lot more attractive place to live. And that's brought more people who are working in the tech sector, and then that's generated more knowledge spillovers. So in a way, what's happened is that one reason why Silicon Valley keeps growing is because there's all these positive spillovers that are already happening, and it's harder to recreate that in another place where those aren't happening, and you need to get sort of a larger mass. And so we can think of that as like a giant spillover, a giant externality. Essentially, it's a form of a network externality where the value rises as more people use the good, right? So it's not necessarily just I get a benefit from something someone else is doing, but just as more people use it, this becomes more valuable. And that can be things like telephones. I don't know about telegraphs and fax machines, but any sort of communication system, social networking, railway systems, air travel, all of these work because other people use them. And so often what you'll see is a subsidy to kind of get those things started because they won't be valuable until there's sort of a critical mass of folks there. So that's where we'll start. In the next video, we'll do a little bit of practice.